Welcome to the Mixtape with Scott. I'm your host, Scott Cunningham. This week we have a guest on the show that is named Wilbert Vander Klaauw. He's an economic research advisor on household and public policy research at the New York Federal Reserve Bank. Dr. Vander Klaauw is an interesting part of the causal inference story. He did early work on the regression discontinuity design that sort of was, one of these first movers, along with like Sandy Black and Josh Angress in the econ. And so it was a really great opportunity to talk to him, talk about his career, talk about some of his how he got from the from Erasmus University as a college student, and then got to Brown University, and then from there ended up at NYU and North Carolina, and finally left academia to go to the Fed. We learned about some of his research and as well as some of his classmates, and I hope you enjoy this interview. Thanks so much for turning in. Bye. All right. Well, it's my pleasure to have with me an economist on the podcast that I've followed their work for a long time, but I've never gotten to actually meet them before. Dr. Vander Klaauw, thank you for being on the podcast.
Great to be on it.
Okay, well, will you tell, for the sake of the listener, tell us your entire name and where you're currently employed and what your job title is?
So my name is Wilbert Vander Klaauw, and I'm an economic policy advisor at the New York Fed.
Okay, great. Awesome. This will be the first time we've spoken with an economist that worked in the Fed. I'm looking forward to this. So, all right, but before we get started, would you mind telling me, as for an icebreaker, would you mind telling me a vacation that you took as a kid that, you still think about it from time to time? It may not be your favorite, but it still pops in your head every now and then.
As a kid, my parents were travelers. They really like going on vacation, so there's a lot there to think of. I guess one that stuck in my mind is one when I was around 14, 15. We went on vacation to the US, to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and my mom. So I grew up in the Netherlands, but my mom had a pen pal in the US in Albuquerque, and so one summer the whole family went on vacation to Albuquerque. So we spent 3 weeks there, and then after that a weekend around New York City. But those 3 weeks were really remarkable because first of all, it's such a striking place to visit. And I remember, it's like the desert, but then in the evening you get this rain and the smell of it. And I think we went on trips to like Santa Fe, El Paso, places like that, and it was just an awesome trip.
That part of the country is beautiful too. I only recently have started going there on road trips, but it is gorgeous. Okay, that's awesome. So you said you grew up in the Netherlands.
Yes.
Okay. Where in the Netherlands was it?
A small town, about a mile from the North Sea coast, and it's about equally distance from Amsterdam and Rotterdam. So it's close to The Hague.
Okay.
It's in an area. It's known for the tulips. It's the bulb area.
Yeah.
There's a lot of farmland, and in season it looks beautiful. There's it's flowers all over.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, so what did your parents do for a living?
My dad was a builder, a contractor, so he built a lot of standalone houses in the area.
Yeah.
And my mom was the bookkeeper and homemaker.
Oh, okay. She was the bookkeeper for his company?
His firm, yeah.
Oh, okay, great. So your family I'm assuming, is it right? Your family and your grandparents and your great grandparents, they'd all been from that area for a long, long time?
They all lived in the same area. I think if by my whole extended family, everybody lives in that family, in that area at that point, except for one aunt who moved to Canada when I was little.
Mm,
But yeah, it's a very, yeah, everybody, and most of them still live there. Yeah.
yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, so when you were like maybe 10 or 11 years old and it was a Saturday, during the year, what could I have found you doing? What would you have been doing on a random Saturday?
Boy. Uh, yeah, I guess it depends on the season. Like in season, I'll be working. Did some work on the ball fields. I mean, a lot of people there in season. Do you do that kind of work?
Yeah.
Um, I would go fishing, hang out with friends. Uh, yeah, just locally.
Okay. How big was this town?
Um, about I would say 15,000. It's not
Okay.
like really small, but it
Yeah.
is really kind of a farming community.
Mm,
Um, And as I said, it's close to the North Sea coast. So in season, the beaches are, there's a lot of tourists.
hmm
But yeah, it's a very pretty area.
Well, so what did you want to be when you were growing up? If you would, maybe like early high school, what did you think you wanted to be?
Early high school, I think I was interested in becoming a professor.
Oh, yeah?
I know it's very strange, but when I was asked like, what do you want to be? I think I always said either professor or diplomat.
Oh, how'd you even have those ideas in your head?
I don't know. I think the traveling got me thinking about, being a diplomat and professor. I guess, I was doing well in my studies and
Mm,
uh, I felt like that would be an interesting thing to do. Not really knowing much about it when I was, that age, but yeah, it's just something that I guess that the, what was kind of different about that view was that I was expected, I guess, to follow my dad and take over the company.
oh,
Uh, but I never felt like that was my interest. So it's
right,
so I just came up with those two things. I guess.
right. Oh, okay, okay. Well, how big was your high school then?
So I didn't go to the high school in the village. I went to the high school in Leiden, which is about 10 miles
Hmm.
from where I lived. So I would go there by bike, and I think it was maybe 1,500 students, something like that.
Hmm.
That was the size, and it attracted kids from the whole area.
Hmm.
So there were a couple of kids, from my town,
Hmm.
and we would often bike together. But then there are kids from other rural areas as well as people from Leiden itself.
Yeah, yeah.
And it was an interesting school. It was a Franciscan school, so there were still some monks teaching
hmm
in their robes, and they had a chapel, and but they were very progressive. Uh,
Hmm.
they were, yeah, actually, I think they were Franciscans. Yeah, they were
Hmm.
Franciscan,
Hmm.
but it
Wait,
was a good school.
so this was a Catholic school that you were attending
Yes.
for high school? It was a
Yeah.
big Catholic school? Huh.
Yep.
So it was like some more selective Catholic, like college prep school or something like that?
Well, all the schools are kind of religious
Yeah,
in my area. So in town, uh, like elementary school was either Catholic or Protestant school.
yeah.
And in the area, yeah, that was kind of a legacy at
Mm,
the time that most schools still had a religious affiliation.
okay,
So it
okay.
didn't really mean that much. In most schools, it didn't mean anything really.
Yeah,
But at the school I went to, which is called Bonaventura in Leiden, there, they still had, the chapels and some of the monks,
right,
and
right, right,
yeah,
right.
but it was a good place.
Well, so you end up at Erasmus. So what were when you were graduating high school, what was your horizon like? Were you sort of thinking I have all these places I might want to go, or were you sort of dialed in to go to like I don't really know a lot about the universities in the Netherlands.
So yeah, the system is different in that you have to choose a major, really kind of a college major when you're like 17.
Mm,
And that's the courses you take
yeah.
beginning. And so I was interested in architecture.
Mm.
Uh, so I went, and then I was also interested in economics and math
Oh,
because
okay.
those are the kind of the things I was good at.
Yeah.
And I thought math by itself might be a little bit too dry, and I wanted something more applied. So then I learned there was something called econometrics. And
Really?
so I
In high
actually,
school, you learned about econometrics?
I heard there was such a major when you
Oh,
go to university, and so I thought, okay, let's check that out. So basically, I narrowed it down to two choices:
mhm.
econometrics or architecture. And so I went to the open house in both. The one was in Delft, a town, not that far, and then econometrics. I went to Erasmus
Yeah.
for the open house, and there was, I was living equally distant between Amsterdam and Rotterdam, and they both have econometrics. But Rotterdam has, of course, the history of Tinbergen, and
Right.
it had a whole, good reputation in econometrics.
Yeah.
Anyway, that the open house made all the difference because the housing market at that time, construction was not really great, and so when I went to the open house in Delft, they were saying things don't look very good, and terms
Mm,
of job wise, and my dad had come along and he said, well, it doesn't sound that great. And then instead, econometrics, that was an area where you
mm.
basically had a guaranteed job once you're done.
With econometrics,
Yes.
what kind of jobs were available for somebody majoring
Well,
in econometrics?
yeah, it's basically it's a very rigorous training in statistics and some economics. And then there were two streams. One, you go into industry, you go corporate,
Yeah.
and there's a big demand there for econometricians
Uh,
for their skills. And then the other stream was academic. And yeah, I ended up going to Erasmus, and I still remember the first week. It was at that time, I don't know if it still is, but it was a pretty big program in that there were 100 of us incoming doing econometrics as a major. But it was a very tough program. So on the first day, I remember I was sitting, in between two people, and they told us, well, look at the neighbor next to you on either side. Only one of you will be left over after 2 years, because they knew that the dropout rate was very 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 big. So
oh,
and it was a 4-year program, so they said, yeah, in the end will only be one of three left, and then it turned out that both those people next to me became my friends, and we all made it. But yeah, one guy sitting on one side was Guido Imbens.
really?
Yeah, and so yeah, we became good friends, and we survived that program. It was very interesting. It started off a lot of math and statistics, and then you start doing econometrics courses. Um, Not so much economics, except for the modeling part.
Yeah.
But yeah, but it was tough. Uh,
Wow. Erasmus has always had this
yeah,
econometrics major like that.
yes, yes,
Wow.
yeah.
So how would you describe to me from America being, younger and having we don't have an econometrics major at Baylor. So what
Right.
kind of coursework is this? Like philosophically and what's different? Because this is
I
before this causal inference stuff.
well, so I would say in the beginning it's very similar to statistics.
Yeah.
So we do a lot of statistics, and then math. The usual kind of. We did a lot of linear algebra.
Mm.
Uh, all the kind of things that we advise people to take when they go to grad school.
Yeah.
But then,
And
the courses, yeah.
an econometrics major is probably definitely preparing you for graduate school.
Oh,
Whereas,
yeah.
whereas an
Yeah,
econ major, you could easily imagine taking no math in an econ major, but that's impossible in an econometrics major.
right. Yeah, yeah, no, that's right. the fallback, I mean, all these people that dropped out, they all went to economics.
Yeah.
Because it
Oh,
was, it was not as difficult. And I think that I almost felt like they made it extra difficult.
mm,
Just, I don't know why, but we benefited from that because we learned a lot.
yeah, I
And
bet.
of course, there were the big models, econometric models, there was like the Rotterdam model, all the systems of demand. Um, I remember a course on queuing theory, which I never ended up using any of that stuff, but still it was interesting. It's like, what's the optimal way of queuing in supermarkets and
Yeah.
all, there's a
Oh,
whole
yeah.
statistics and everything
Yeah.
around that. And then we had a Fortran course. Of course, this was old style, so we had these cards that
Yeah.
we had to fill in, and yeah. So it was an interesting experience.
That's
And
wild.
yeah, that's
Huh. So you end up doing this master. So you already were pretty much committed to becoming a professor, but this experience with econometrics seems to, this story with you and
yeah.
Emmons both go to Hull, right? Is that because y'all end
Yeah,
up with
that's an
Lancaster?
interesting story. Yeah,
How is
it's
that happening?
so after the third year, or in the third year, I read about this exchange program that
Yeah.
Rotterdam had with the University of Hull,
Yeah.
and we knew there was a good econometrician there, Tony Lancaster, and the idea sounded very interesting, just to spend a year in England and
Yeah.
meeting him and taking some courses there. And so I was trying to convince my friends, you know, to go along, and because there were several openings, and Gita was the only one who was interested. So we decided to do it, and that's how we ended up there. And then it turned out to be a really lively place.
Mhm.
Um, there was a lot of people coming through from the US. There are, some really good economists there that we ended up working with, besides Tony. So Tony Lancaster, Peter Dalton, Jerry
Mm.
Makepeace, Alessandro Signo. There's a whole. It was a very lively place, and we somehow, uh, kind of thrived in that environment.
Mm.
We were challenged to. Um, to speak our minds and ask questions. And we had a lot of fun, actually. It was,
Wow. Huh. So you and Emmons were pretty tight then. Y'all were close friends
oh,
back then.
yeah, yeah, since, that first day in Rotterdam, since we both just turned 18. So ever since then, we've known each other very well. And
So Tony Lancaster leaves for Brown, and Emmons had told me he goes with Tony Now I'm realizing Tony Lancaster asks both of y'all to come with him.
so so we did the masters at Hull, and then, I mean, I always had hoped to go to America for grad school.
Yeah.
But then Tony suddenly tells us that he's planning to move. He was part of that brain drain. A lot of people in England, successful professor, quite a few economists, they left for the US.
Mm.
And so Tony told us about this place called Brown University. And we hadn't done any research at that point,
Mm.
because we were planning to go back to Holland and then apply. And so suddenly we're like, okay, we should maybe apply now. And so we both frantically like had to take the GRE and do all these, applications. But then it just made sense for us to just go to Brown. I mean,
Mm.
first found out it's a very good place, and there were some really good people there. And then of course we knew Tony, so it was almost natural for us to follow, and so that's what we did.
Mm. So you get to Brown, the thing that I notice in your Vita that's, I think probably I knew of your work on, because of my kind of obsession with causal inference. I've been very familiar with several of the RD papers that you wrote.
Mhm.
But it's a lot clearer when I look at your Vita. It almost seems like you're primarily a labor economist mainly, right?
Yes.
That would be the right way to talk about you. You
Yes.
make these classical contributions to econometrics, but you can tell you're very interested in labor supply and things like that.
Yes.
Is that
Yeah.
so?
That actually started in Rotterdam. Uh,
Oh,
I took a course there. There was a Belgian economist called Jules Thewes, and he got his PhD at UBC, British Columbia, and he invited in these economists like Glenn Kane and Art Goldberger, econometrician, and then at Hull there were a lot of applied micro labor people there.
mm,
So there we started estimating. Of course, Tony was doing all the stuff on duration analysis, transition data. So um, and but then a lot of people were doing discrete choice models, and of course this was all the time about selection bias,
right.
all the stuff, and so I got really into that, estimating these models,
Yeah.
and then at Brown was Robert Moffat, so I ended up
Oh,
working actually more with Robert than with Tony in the end,
huh.
because Robert also, of course, top labor economist, but also interested in the structural modeling.
Right.
And at that time, it was the transition from going from static models, discrete choice models, to dynamic discrete choice models with forward-looking behavior. So
Mm,
dynamic programming models. And so I was very interested in that. And so
mm.
that's kind of what I did for my thesis at Brown.
Is it
And
Moffat
uh,
that's your advisor?
yeah, both Moffat and Lancaster.
Huh.
Lancaster also was more interested in structural stuff. He had done interesting work uh, on reservation wages, job search models
Oh,
earlier, before all the duration stuff. So it was all, a lot of people around me were kind of interested in labor economics, and so I became that as well.
wow. Wow. So, so, so you graduate. What was your job market paper about?
It was about female labor supply and
Yeah.
marriage decisions, marriage and divorce. So it was really looking at the dynamics, the interactions between that, and just modeling those decisions jointly. Um,
Mm.
yeah,
Oh, so it was the structural style work that you were
very
doing.
structural. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So so when is it? Okay, I do want to ask this, but I'll first ask this. So you graduate and you go
Hmm.
to New York. You end up at NYU?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what year is that? I don't
That's
have
in 91.
91. Okay. So do you end up because of your later econometrica that's like using this potential outcomes notation,
Mhm.
is that something that you're picking up at Brown? Are you picking up this like potential outcomes
Oh,
language at all?
at Brown, no, it wasn't there yet. But I did get very interested in natural experiments.
Yeah.
Um,
When does that first start? I saw the 95 article on conscription, but is that the first
yeah.
time?
The first that was my first paper where it was more kind of an IV type thing. So I got interested in it even before, even though I was doing structural work.
Yeah.
When Guido obviously got interested in that, he was taking courses at Harvard while at Brown, and so. But I was also interested in the stuff, Angerst and Kruger, that paper, quarter of birth,
Yeah.
and then Angerst and Levy on class size, the Maimonides rule,
Mhm.
and papers like that. Of course, the border discontinuities. I mean, the minimum wage stuff.
Yeah.
So that was all happening at that time.
Yeah.
Uh, so I was definitely interested in that as well because there obviously is the question when you have you estimate structural models, but where does identification come from? And that's kind of one thing these papers raised. You have to think about exogeneity, exclusion. It sharpened all those ideas about
Yeah.
what you need for identification.
Right, right, right. Well, wait a second. So you're like kind of in my mind, I have this like view of people that kind of sort
Mhm.
reduced form or structural. But that doesn't sound like necessarily what, because you've got this like large body of skills that comes from your structural, and you're picking up this like reduced form approach. Did you ever feel like I've got to be one, I am one or the other, or was it just like you just worked on whatever you wanted to work on and it didn't necessarily require having some like specialized set of skills?
Um, no, I found both of them very interesting. I never felt like one was right and the other one was wrong. I always felt they're actually both very interesting. And
Mm,
to me, my ideal research project would be to use both of them. Uh, so, let's say you run an randomized experiment, so you have really good, source of variation to exploit.
yep.
Then you want to also use some structure to help interpret the results.
Mm,
uh, and look at multiple outcomes together, not which models kind of force you to do. You're thinking more about mechanisms and multiple outcomes. Well, in causal inference, usually you have like a single outcome variable, and you have an intervention that the effect you want to estimate of. And so I always felt like they're both very useful,
yeah.
and maybe in combination, it's maybe the strongest,
Yeah.
possibility. But so I was working both on structural stuff, and of course, NYU is known for structural work. Chris Flynn and Ken Wolpen were there,
Mm,
uh, and later on, Mike Keane, who he was also a student from Brown from those days. He was ahead of us, but he was close. We overlapped by a year, I think. So it was a very structural place at NYU, but I was interested in this causal inference work as well, and so that's how actually I got into. I had already done this paper with Guido on using basically variation coming from lotteries in
yeah.
the Netherlands in military drafts.
Yeah.
So we looked at the effect of the draft on earnings later on, like serving a year and a half in the military.
Yeah.
Um, so I done that, but then I got the then I got into regression discontinuity designs, and that was by accident. So this is in I would say 1995 or so,
Oh.
and the dean at NYU had come to the economics department and said, "We have all this data on enrollments, and people who we offer financial aid, and kind of people who've applied, and then we're trying to figure out how to optimally allocate financial aid offers to people who have been admitted to NYU. Basically, they wanted to maximize yield,
Oh.
but they wanted to do it in a way where they get the right mix of people. But I got interested in that question because when I first thought about it, it's like, okay, the best students, like, because a lot of it is merit aid, so you probably give more to the merit, to the really good students, but they are not coming to NYU. They end up at Harvard and other places. So if you run that regression, you're probably going to get a negative effect. So I
Right.
asked them, so what have you been doing so far? And they said, well, we have consultants and they tell us what to do. And so I got very interested in, like, okay, what are the consultants doing? Because this is a very tough causal
Yep.
question.
Yep.
And so I decided that, I would like to look at the data, and they asked for an RA. So they gave me some funds for an RA. And when I looked at the data, I found out what they were doing. They were grouping people based on their GPA and SAT scores.
Mm,
And there were these cutoffs. And then they were assigning these amounts of money to, based on which category you fell into, which group you fell into.
yeah.
And so when you plotted that in the data, you see these big jumps, at these cutoffs.
Mm,
And so that made me think, like, okay, this is like it's like when you look at the near the cutoff, it's like random. It's like random assignment. I mean, there is a similarity there.
Nobody's working on RD at this time.
Nobody,
You
nobody.
didn't even have anybody to
Well,
talk to about it.
no, well,
I know
I
there's
mean,
that Ingerson Levy paper, but this seems a little more. Go ahead.
yeah. Well, exactly. There, I think people were using it, but they didn't realize it was what they were doing. That their design, their case they were looking at was a regression discontinuity design. Like Angerst and Levy, definitely, that's right. There's like a sharp cutoff when you hit a certain number of students, you add another class and you get this discontinuity.
Yeah.
And border discontinuity, maybe not, but quarter of birth is very much also so. In each state, there's a birthday cutoff,
Mhm.
and it's really an RD, but they implemented it as an IV. But so I recognize that
You
okay, this is like
recognize that people were using IV. You could tell there was something about it that you could tell that you didn't feel like it was instrumental variables. It was something else.
um no, I felt when I first saw it, it definitely reminded me of those papers. And
Right.
then the more I dug into it and realized that this was like a regression discontinuity design, I
Mm.
realized that that's the one that also applied to their models, to
Mm.
their the causal questions that they were trying to answer.
Mm.
And but the way I remember I was starting to look for was there anything like this on like these discontinuities, and Guido had given a talk at NYU at some point, and I was telling him about this, and he said he didn't know, but he said you should look at this uh, Campbell paper,
Yeah.
uh, um, a book. Sorry, it was a book. And I'll forget
Campbell and Cook.
yeah, Cook and Campbell. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I looked at that, and they had all these quasi-experimental designs, and that's right. And then that's what this regression discontinuity design was there. But then they hadn't really worked it out. I mean, the intuition was there. They talked a little bit about this randomization at the cutoff, but then they focused a lot on extrapolating,
Right.
and there it was all functional form.
Yes.
And they didn't really at that time, because that dates from the 60s, right? That
Right.
earlier work in education psychology, basically, it dates from the 60s. And so everything was parametric. They didn't have non-parametrics then.
Yeah.
And so, but those papers were useful for me, because then I could try to kind of figure out, what was going on. And then around that time, I was going on sabbatical, and I was spending some time at Penn. And that's how I met Petra Todd and Jin Han, and we started talking. And we both, the three of us had the same view about, because of this, about those papers, Angerst and Levy and so on, that those are not really IV, because if you think about RD and the running variable, the whole problem that you're facing there is that you worry that this running variable is correlated with potential outcomes, right? If it wasn't, then it's like a lottery. Then you already
Yeah.
have randomization, and you don't even, have to restrict yourself to the cutoff. You could just use it as a just random variation in assignment.
Yeah.
So any function of that running variable wouldn't really make a lot of sense as an instrumental variable, but it becomes like a randomized assignment when you take it to the limit,
Mm.
when you approach from both sides. And so I always felt like, it was like IV in a limit. That's the way I saw it.
Mm. Mm. And so you and Petra and Han were just sort of sitting around. Uh, Han said that Angers had come and presented that Maimonides paper, and
Mhm.
and he had an
Yeah.
issue with it, and y'all started talking. So what do you remember? How does this paper get born?
Yeah, well, I already had my paper, right?
You had
This
this
stuff.
paper that gets published in IER.
Yeah, it gets published later. Everything took a long time in those days. And and also nobody knew what to make of it.
Right.
Right? So I had this paper on regression discontinuity, and I sent it to a journal, a top journal, and it got back in a couple of weeks. And they didn't know what to make of it. And then later on, I talked to Josh Angrist and Alan Kruger, and they were always very supportive. They're trying to also explain to me that of course people might have trouble trying to understand what this is about and kind of a new thing, and then I think there were also perceptions out there that this was a very special case, that there were these discontinuities. And I must admit, even I thought, yes, I knew there were going to be discontinuities in life. I mean, people, they draw thresholds, right, for assignments. They often do like in groups or just like
yeah. You saw it as like, yeah, this is going to be everywhere.
Yeah, it's going to. Well, I didn't think it was that, that it was so widespread. I didn't realize, and I think a lot of people thought it was much less applicable than it turned out to be. So initially, when I was doing it, a lot of people thought, oh, it was kind of cute, but they didn't think it was really that applicable. That's the perception I got. But so I had that paper, and then I started to talk with Eugene and Petra, and because we really wanted to nail down identification, because that had never been done in that literature. And so we worked on that, and of course, all the late stuff was happening at that time, and it applied, perfectly to this. So, that's how the paper came about. We had a couple of, we had some iterations. It was just, just meeting the right people. We all had the similar ideas about it from the beginning. And it was very productive. It was really,
When did you notice it was being so impactful? Or like, when did you notice that you're like, man, I've really contributed with these two papers to something that's taken off? Did you notice it pretty quickly or what?
Well, I started feeling like this was something, useful when I gave a talk at MIT and I gave a talk at Princeton, and I started getting feedback. People clearly, appreciated this. And then I started seeing other applications. And then also the people who, like even Sandy Black, right, that paper originally where you also look at house prices and you relate it to quality of schooling on borders, either side of the street. When you then, all of these then became clear that these were kind of like regression discontinuities. And then I was working on some other applications, and then I started seeing more and more applications. I know David Card got very interested in it, and David Lee, and lots of other people started working on it. Then we had a conference. I think David Card organized a conference that became like a special issue of the Journal of Econometrics. And there were a lot of really good people there. And so that's when it really started taking off. But I never thought that, maybe another 4 or 5 years later, when you looked on the people on the job market, it was like
everybody
everywhere.
Wow, that's really cool. That's a neat story. So this decision in 06 to leave Chapel Hill, you're a full professor at UNC Chapel Hill, to go to the Fed. I'm curious, what prompted you to make a move like that?
Again, kind of a random thing. I had sabbatical and I came to the Fed, and while we were at the Fed, first of all, my wife and I, we kind of realized how much we missed the city.
Yeah.
But then also the environment at the Fed was really not what I expected. There were already quite a few micro people, applied micro people, and it was a very stimulating environment, lots of resources. And while I was here, I was very much, this is kind of, again, my structural background. I've always been interested in subjective expectations. Like when we write down these models and we make assumptions how people form expectations, those are very strong assumptions. And And so the question is, why don't we collect that kind of data? And Chuck Mansky had been starting doing this, and I thought that work was really interesting and very important. So while I was here as a visitor, I wrote a proposal. I drafted a proposal and then worked with people here, uh, which was to the proposal was to do research on collecting expectations data. Of course, the Fed in particular is interested in inflation expectations, but
Right.
it was always my idea that if we pull this off, we're going to ask about lots of stuff about the labor market and housing market and lots of other things. And so, but to my surprise, they said, why don't we do this?
You were
And
there on sabbatical, and
yeah,
in your head, you're already thinking about expectations because of earlier stuff, but you start having conversations with senior people at the Fed
yes.
about this, and you're surprised by how interested they are.
Yes, well, yes, we have Joe Tracy, of course, he's an applied micro labor the guy who was the head of research, Simon Potter, a group of really smart people. Tim Geithner was the president, and they said, well, let's do this. And
Mm,
then subsequently, Bill Dudley was the president after that, and currently John Williams. They all have been extremely supportive of this kind of work.
mm,
Uh, so we started this survey. But we did that only after a 6 year of experimentation. And we did all of that testing at the beginning, a question wording, how do you collect these probabilistic expectations? What's the best way of doing it? We work with behavioral psychologists on like, can you really ask people about inflation? And we tried lots of different ways of doing that. So we learned a huge amount. And then, at the same time, we have the financial crisis happening. And Geithner says, like, how come we didn't see this coming? How come we didn't know that people were in so much mortgage debt? We need more data. And so they asked me to look into credit report data. So I pulled in a colleague, Dong-Moon Lee here at the Fed, and we designed this sampling frame to get credit report data. And now we have this database and we have this quarterly report of household debt and credit.
yeah.
That is also very impactful. And that we created that all, because the Fed has those resources.
Wow.
And so it's really a great place to work because, these resources, the data, the colleagues are fantastic, the RAs are really great. So I felt like, well, why would I go back? I mean, this is it was maybe a bit of a risk, but I felt like I would never have that opportunity as a professor,
Yeah.
right? Imagine the NSF grants you would need year
Mm,
after year, to run an expensive survey
yeah.
or to buy these credit report data
Yep.
in a quarterly frequency. And, we have credit report data for 25 million people every quarter.
Mm,
So that and this is obviously great for research.
mm,
And so that's the other thing at the Fed. You get exposed to more areas,
right.
beyond just labor economics. So I got
Yeah.
interested in household finance, um, urban economics a little bit, and yeah, you kind of spread your, of course, inflation expectations. We do a lot of policy work with that, which is very useful too for how we make the decisions here. So yeah, I think altogether it's I felt that like I can always go back to academics if I wanted to. I mean, I missed the teaching a little bit of the graduate students, but then we have these RAs that go off to graduate school here, and they are so good.
Mm,
So we get kind of the same experience.
yeah.
Uh, and
Were
and
you
then
surprised that you had these skills doing
yeah,
things like creating a giant survey and things like that, that you don't necessarily get that training in graduate school?
that's true. I did. I mean, I was always interested in surveys, and when I spent a sabbatical, it's like one semester at the University of Essex in England, and I was visiting an institute there that does the surveys many of the big surveys in England, and I learned a lot there. And actually, I presented my very early draft of the RD paper there, and the
Mm,
same thing there. They thought, they've all thought it was interesting, but they couldn't make sense.
Yeah.
of whether this would be important or not, but they were really good at doing surveys. So I got a real good, appreciation of that, of doing that kind of work. And sure, it was a bit of a risk, and the Fed took a bit of a risk, but we had a really good team. I pulled in a lot of advisors, so Chuck Mansky, Ken Wolpen, and a whole bunch of people, macroeconomists, monetary. We all brought them in, and we got advice from them. And then, as I said, we had like 6 years of experimentation. Uh,
Mm.
and the team here also was very strong. We had Bassett Zafar was here at that time, Olivier Armentier and Georgia Topa, Gizem Kosar, and now Jason Somerville. So we have really good people,
Mm.
and the group has been, fairly stable over time. That also helps. But yeah, it came out. It's better than I ever expected, I guess.
Well, what's one of the more exciting findings that you feel like, this whole thing is paid off for you because of, this a couple of things that you found that you just were not expecting or couldn't have known about?
Um, well, I still feel like we're still early in discovering how
Yeah.
people form expectations,
Uh-huh.
how they use them in making decisions,
Mm.
and how they matter, like even in the household context, right? I mean, people might have different expectations and they still come to a decision. I still feel like, expectations are underappreciated, even in work on causal inference.
Uh-huh.
Right? If you think about causal inference, if you look at most of the methods, they want to rule out anticipation effects.
Yeah.
And anticipation effects I find actually very interesting,
Mhm.
because in many cases it is not the case that things were totally unexpected.
Right.
Sure, I mean, people might have given it a low probability,
Yeah.
but in many cases, these things are announced in advance, and so
Mm.
then if you then checking your data and you don't find an anticipation effect, you don't find any evidence of that, then you could say, okay, see, I mean, we can ignore the issue and we just do our different diff or whatever we want to do.
Yeah.
But I feel like we're missing something there, because that actually tells us something. If there was
Yeah.
no anticipatory behavior,
Right.
and even though we have a good idea that people, that this information was out there already, it was announced,
Yeah.
that actually tells us a lot.
Yeah.
But we have an identification problem, because it could be that people didn't know about it,
Right.
or they knew about it, but they didn't find it, optimal to react on that, to change their behavior. Now, that is really telling us a lot
Mm.
about that program. And, because if people are forward looking and they can plan in advance as intertemporal substitution, you would expect some behavior beforehand. So
Yeah.
I feel like there's a lot of information there that we are not exploring.
Mm.
But really, to solve that, you need expectations data.
Wow. Wow.
And so
What's
that's
the
what
name
we're
of this
doing.
data set? What is this data set y'all have collected?
So this is a survey of consumer expectations. So we are tracking inflation expectations at the 1, 3, and 5 year horizons, and we don't just ask for a point forecast. We ask for the whole distribution.
Oh.
And you think, like, can people do that? Yeah, they can do that. I mean, we've done it many different ways, and it's really, and now other central banks, there are a lot of other surveys now doing the same thing.
Mm.
But so we ask about inflation, we also about house prices and earnings growth, um, household income. We ask about many, many different things.
Mm.
And then we also run experiments. We run information experiments. We do hypothetical scenario, like kind of strategic questions that really get at causal patterns.
Mhm.
So then you can see, like, if somebody is an information shock, how do people use it? How
Mhm.
do they update their expectations, and do they also affect their beliefs? So we had one of the first experiments in that, and it's also a way to validate the subjective expectations data that you collect from a survey, because some people say, oh, you can't take that data seriously. People don't really spend much time, they just give you an answer. Well, we designed this experiment where there was like up to $800 on the table, and people had to make decisions and investing in they had to choose between investments. One was indexed to inflation, the other one was not. And we
Mhm.
designed it so that depending on what they thought was going to happen to inflation, they would choose one alternative over the other, and at some point they would switch
Mhm.
because we were increasing the amount in one of the two investments. And to our surprise, I mean, when you look at the actual behavior, it lined up very well with the inflation expectations they've reported at the beginning of the survey, when they had no idea that this question was coming later on, that this experiment was coming.
Mm.
And so that was kind of the first evidence that we had that, people really act on their inflation expectations. And since then, we found all kinds of expectations to predict actual future outcomes. And so there's a lot of information content there. And, and then we found it useful in modeling, there's a whole research agenda we've been working on. And to me personally, this is, I think, one of the big areas right now, and maybe, for the next 10, 20 years,
Mm.
in economics, because we all make assumptions in our models that people are forward looking, and we make these, rational expectations. Now we of course start deviating. That we're more aware of behavioral economics evidence on this. But subjective expectations data, I think, are extremely valuable, and it's going to lead to a lot more research. And so I'm very excited about this, and I've been for a long time.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
so
Huh. That's fantastic. Well, I know that you have I've gone over what I promised you that I would use, but I guess the only thing I would just say is, uh what about if you were sort of to describe to someone out there who's thinking about leaving academia to go into government, either at the point of the job search or maybe someone that was senior, what would you say are the trade-offs? What have you gained in your life, and what do you think that you did not get to carry with you?
I don't, my approach is that, when opportunities arise, sometimes you take a chance,
Yeah.
and it's worked out very well. I feel like, I learned a lot more. But, I think both experiences are very useful. And for people who are even, in labor economics or applied micro, I think the Fed is a really good place to start, actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Bassett Zafar started there, Sandy Black started here. Then there are many examples, and some stay in the reserve system, others go to universities, become professors, and the other way around, like me. So it is still very academic, the environment in most of the Federal Reserve banks. And so you can still do a lot of the things you're interested in, but you do it in an environment where it's more policy relevant, your work gets more attention,
Yeah.
like the media picks it up very quickly, and you just feel like you're part, you're closer to, the real policy making. And for many of us, that's kind of, ultimately what matters most. Like, it's citations is great,
Right.
but where actually people use your work,
Right.
and it's discussed at the highest level, that's a whole different thing.
It's a totally different deal. Wow. Well, it's been really nice to hear this story. I really appreciate you giving me your time to talk to me. It's great to meet and great to hear all this.
Well, thanks, Scott. It was great talking to you.